Hey everyone, welcome to the Christ Pearls channel. I wanted to go live really quick. My kids are being really good right now, so I figured I'd hurry and jump on and talk about something that I just saw a little buzz going on social media. Hey Tim, how's it
What's
going? Thanks for
it's
coming.
go are we live right now?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm like, not even
Yeah,
ready
I'm
to
just
go.
gonna do a really quick little live stream. Thanks for coming because it's fun to have somebody to talk to, so I don't have to talk to myself the whole time.
So, okay, clue me in on what you're talking about, what's going on.
Yeah, so okay, so let me share my screen really quick just so I can clue you in, like you said, and the audience here. There was recently um like a episode, it was actually two episodes that was on the Stick of Joseph, and they let's see, I think I'm gonna share my entire can I share my window? Yeah, let me share this window. So that way I can show you guys the whole thing. Can you see that? Okay, there.
I
You
can
see
see
it,
that,
right?
yeah.
Okay. So I pulled up several tabs, and we're going to look at this one in a second. But on the Stick of Joseph, they recently interviewed one of my favorite scholars, which is Dr. Avraham Gileadi. And he gets a really mixed bag on, like, even Fair LDS did like some what I felt like was a hit piece on him a long time ago. And it was just because there's like all these rumors about him, and it was based on just a point where he had been excommunicated, and then he got reinstated. And there was just like a whole discrepancy and thing about that. And I'm not going to talk about that because this is not my story. That's his story. But that's
Right,
why he gets such a mixed bag. And what that had to do with was this specific teaching about there being like this end time servant role in Isaiah. And some people view this as Joseph Smith. He's just of the opinion that it's not just Joseph Smith. Joseph is like a type or like part of that pattern because there's
right.
like a collective servant idea. So I want to explain that. I want to explain really quickly, as briefly as I can, just a couple of theories because this is a very esoteric subject. And whenever you're in this realm of like esotericism, there's a lot of opinions, and people, one person's like, well, I'm right. And because I showed in the scriptures, another person's like, well, I'm right. I showed in the scriptures. And the truth is that there's not a lot from the prophets and apostles on this, but there is a little bit. And so I wanted to show that this is an actual thing, and
Right,
that this is like an actual real idea. There's kind of two prevailing theories about it. The prophets and the apostles, they tend to focus on one
mhm,
idea and one layer, which is the ultimate fulfillment, which is Jesus Christ, obviously. And so that if you want to understand the other part of or other layer of this idea, then you have to dig a little bit beyond what the Institute manual points you to. And you have to kind
right.
of start looking at it from the layered perspective. And so I want to just show that and share some study tools and resources on this topic for people so that if they felt off put by the fact that the Stick of Joseph even interviewed Avraham Gileadi, which some people do, some people they're like really angry that they even interviewed him. And then others, they love it. I loved it. I was like, oh, it's awesome that they interviewed him. I have read most of his books. I've read his dissertation, The Literary Messages of Isaiah, or The Literary Message of Isaiah, and I had him he, like, actually signed it for me, and I got to take a picture with him at, like, a book
R
signing, and, like, at the time when he did a lecture. It was pretty recently, and, he's come and spoken in some of the book clubs that I've participated in with Isaiah
right.
Institute. I've been studying with the Institute since, like, about 2019. It is
Mhm,
helpful. It's very helpful for understanding Isaiah. I've read a lot of books on Isaiah. I've
right,
read Carrie Mulesin's, I've read Don Perry's, I've read, like, pretty much everybody, David J. Ridges, like, all the classic ones. I've read the Messiah
right.
series by Bruce R. McConkie. Like, I've read all of these things. I've read, Doctrines of Salvation. Like, I understand that there's, like, lots of different viewpoints on it, and some
Right.
people
Now,
get
is
really
this
upset about it.
specifically sticking to Isaiah? Because
So
what I'm
he is an
hearing from
Isaiah
you.
scholar, and he
Okay, so he's
his
he's Isaiah's scholar. Well,
he
I
yeah.
guess my question is how does this fit? Because we're familiar with the often cited passage of the two sticks, taking the Ezekiel
Mhm.
37 passage of the two sticks, the stick of Joseph and the stick of Ephraim.
Yeah,
And and the reason why I'm bringing that up is because when you read through that, there is where it says, "My servant David shall be king over them." It's not referring to David himself, but it's referring to this Davidic king
right.
who is a servant,
Right. And
the
that's the
Davidic
point.
king servant. So is
And
that what where you're
yeah.
coming from?
Yep.
Okay,
And that's one of the main passages of scripture that really conflicts with the idea that this servant is Jesus Christ. In fact, it's probably the main one, but it's supported by Isaiah
hmm,
that there is some servant. And so I want to explain this on two levels.
okay,
There's a collective servant. Joseph Smith is part of that collective servant. He's the servant in terms of like the restoration part of that whole process of restoration because he lays the foundation. But obviously, Joseph Smith died. He didn't do it all by himself. And we continue to do like a restoration process. It's an ongoing restoration. There are some theories that he's going to be resurrected and come back and do all this stuff. And the main argument against that theory is just, well, he's a resurrected being, and resurrected beings don't do the
right,
things that mortals do. There's always a mortal that they work with when they come back to the earth to direct work. And you see that just with the angel Moroni and Joseph Smith. So you see that there's like patterns. And the idea here in the
right,
Hebrew way of thinking is that the patterns repeat all the way up to the second coming with the ultimate fulfillment in Jesus Christ. They happen both historically, they happen in each dispensation on like smaller levels, and then there's like an end time scenario that, according to Gileadi's studies, he believes will repeat just kind of like right at the very, like right when the second coming in glory is about to happen. And the reason that I emphasize in glory is because in Latter day Saint view, we believe in four key appearances of Jesus Christ, and the three that precede the second coming in glory are part of that great gathering of Israel that Isaiah
right.
prophesies. And the way that Gileadi is reading it is that there's stuff that happens there from that point of like Adam on Dayam, New Jerusalem, Old Jerusalem appearances of Christ that is that like end time
So
scenario.
this is more eschatological and more apocalyptic in nature.
Right. But
Okay.
the reason I bring it up is because there's all this controversy over this one scholar. And I actually had two friends of mine um, complain about it. They were like, why are they having this guy on there? And
Well,
I
to
get
be
it
honest,
because
I've
they haven't
never heard
studied any
of
of
this
his work.
person. I've never heard of him until we started interacting and started collaborating. And so I have not ever, I have to look into this person and see if I can't get a hold of some of the sources you have available.
Well, I'm going to share sources. So that's what I want to do
Okay.
today. So this is what I'm kind of piggybacking off of is just this like Stick of Joseph episodes. They did two. They
Right.
interviewed one where he tells his conversion story. It's a really cool story. In fact, there were like two things that he mentioned in that story that I'd never even heard him say before. And I thought I'd
Mhm.
pretty much heard all the different versions of his story, at least from my generation going forward. And he even has an article in the Ensign where he tells his story, and it wasn't even in there. So there were a couple details that they gave in that was pretty cool that he shared. And so it is a great interview. So there's a shout out to them for doing that. And then I want to show.
So real quick question, because going back to the thumbnail, something is
Oh,
kind of striking me a bit here. Because looking at the thumbnail, you've got the Davidic king or the Davidic servant, and then you have the Assyrian king. So I'm assuming this is more of a type and shadow motif,
yeah, they're
that there's a
motifs.
contrast between the Davidic servant and the Davidic
Yes.
king to the Assyrian king yeah, okay.
It's like King of Babylon, King of Assyria. So what he proposes in his dissertation is that the literary structure that he identifies in Isaiah, which is a seven-part structure, and then there's also like a bifid structure and then other little structures, that it basically the way that Isaiah's writing is in the form of these metaphors and motifs. And the two main motifs for righteousness, like the arm of gathering and righteousness versus like the arm of judgment and destruction of the wicked,
Hmm.
is composited into or compiled into two main characters in the story that Isaiah is telling, which is very much like a fairy tale istic story. And the right hand arm that Isaiah labels as like this servant, and he characterizes him. There's all these like attributes of this servant figure. He's communicating with Jehovah. So that's
Mhm.
how you know that it doesn't just apply to Jesus. Jesus is like the ultimate fulfillment of the David who will inherit David's throne, right? Like
Right.
that's the ultimate fulfillment. But the story that Isaiah is telling is not just the ultimate fulfillment. He has a style of writing, and it's through the
Right.
structure that you can see that it's supposed to apply in any time that you live in. And then the final fulfillment is the
Mm.
end time. And so there's
Right.
an end time context where, and this is what people get so upset about, there's an end time context where
Mhm.
the way Giliotti views it is it's both like a spiritual gathering and a literal kind of like physical gathering that precedes the second coming, like right before. And people have a really hard time with that
Right.
because of all of the crazies out there who like claim to be the Davidic servant and this the one mighty and
Well,
strong, and that's been going on since even before Joseph Smith. Okay, like
I
people have
I'm
claimed to
wading
be that.
blindly into the waters here, so but, uh,
So let me show
what I'm
you.
yeah, what I'm hearing though is so is it, an idea that's being, I'm trying to find the words. Is it this idea that the Davidic servant is prophets, the office of the prophet, the prophetic office, the apostolic
Not
office? Not
necessarily.
necessarily. Okay.
No, because it again, this is a composite figure, and
Okay.
that I think that's why people have such a hard time with it. You
Well,
know,
I'm saying that it's not one single person who fulfills that. It's multiple people that are
well,
operating in that apostolic and prophetic calling and authority.
there it's both. Okay, it's
Okay.
both because there's like Joseph Smith definitely fits the majority of what's been fulfilled in terms of the restoration part, like the restorative function, right? Joseph did that. But
Mhm.
there's like an ongoing restoration. Like, for example, we have the Book of Mormon, we have the Doctrine and Covenants, the Pearl of Great Price, but we're also supposed to get other scriptures like the sealed portion
The
and just
sealed
all these different things. And
portion.
so this pattern of how these things are delivered
Mhm.
is kind of taught
Other
as a
tribes,
pattern.
as the gathering starts becoming a literal realization, other tribes are bringing their records.
Well, we believe in the literal gathering of Israel
Right.
and in the restoration of the 10 tribes literally, right? Like
Yeah.
that's in our articles of faith. So that's kind of the idea, is that that isn't fully finished. It doesn't finish really technically until like the end of the millennium, but like at least in terms of the second coming, it finishes when Jesus comes and comes to rule and reign and the millennium begins. That's the ultimate fulfillment of these messianic prophecies. Like part of the fulfillment happened when Christ came in the meridian of time, but the rest of it happens when he comes again. And so the point is that um the point is that they you can't apply it to just one thing. Like you can't say, well, this one thing is the fulfillment, because there's multiple fulfillments. So I actually did a video, a very, very short one, on just how do you know when multiple fulfillment is fulfilled? And the answer is it's not really fulfilled until Christ comes.
Right. So there's
So,
an ongoing fulfillment of the prophecy, the culmination of the fulfillment, but
right.
throughout its culmination, there are those moments in time where the prophecies are um, being fulfilled on different layers.
Right. So we're going to read this. This is Encyclopedia of Mormonism. And I like the way they like defined this, because they were able to, I think, just break it down in a way that's easy to understand and summarize it really briefly. So, in Encyclopedia of Mormonism, it explains kind of the two schools of thought here. It says David, or King David, circa 1000 BC, remains today one
Mhm.
of the most renowned Old Testament figures. His personality, spiritual sensitivity, creative abilities, military victories, and leadership carried him to the pinnacle of popularity. He had the potential to become an ideal king, but his kingship deteriorated after his adultery with Bathsheba and his involvement in Uriah's death. However, prophecy states that a model ruler in the last days will be raised up from David's lineage. The prophet Joseph Smith taught that the throne and kingdom of David is to be taken from him and given to another by the name of David in the last days, raised up out of his lineage. Elder Orson Hyde, in his dedicatory prayer on the Mount of Olives, October 24th, 1841, prophesied that the Jews would return to Jerusalem and that in time a leader called David, even a descendant from the loins of ancient David, would be their king.
David Bednar.
Some people think it's one of the theories, right? Every time a prophet or an apostle is like David, everybody gets all like, oh. And this has been going on for a long time. That's why I want to bring it up, because this is nothing new. There's a young generation now. Obviously, Hayden and Jackson, it's new to them, but this is old to people who are older and have been around. And I am older than
Honestly, I've
them, by the
never
way.
actually heard this,
And
so
I
this is
have
all
heard
new to
this. I
me.
heard this growing up. And so that's why I'm saying, like, this is a thing, and it might be new to you, but it's not new, okay? So
Well,
just
it's new to me, yeah.
I know, but that's my point, is like, if for the audience, like, it might be new to you, but it's not like really new. Like, Encyclopedia of Mormonism is super old. Like, so anyway, going on, it says this predicted figure corresponds to a promised messianic servant. Hosea, speaking shortly before the loss of northern Israel, foretold that Israelites would return in the latter days and seek the Lord their God and David their king. So that's Hosea 3:5. Jeremiah prophesied of Israel and Judah's future righteousness and of David their king, whom I, the Lord, will raise up unto them. And in Ezekiel, it is written, and he's quoting right here Jeremiah 30, verse 9, cross referencing 23:5, 33:15 through 22. And in Ezekiel, it is written, and I will set up one shepherd over them, and he shall feed them, even my servant David, he shall feed them, and he shall be their shepherd. And I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David a prince among them. So that's Ezekiel 34:23 through 24, which are the main verses, like you just noted. And then he's cross referencing. And when I say he, I want to say it was Victor Ludlow that wrote this article, but it'll say on the next page. And then that was also Ezekiel 41, 1 through 3 that you can cross reference. So, speaking to Joseph Smith, the angel Moroni cited Old Testament passages telling of significant figures who would be involved with Christ's millennial reign. This is in Joseph Smith History 140. As prophesied in Isaiah, it appears that two persons are spoken of, a rod and a root. So that's Isaiah 11:1. And also you can cross-reference that with Doctrine and Covenants 113, which he's doing here. So one, a leader on whom there is laid much power, the other, a person with special priesthood keys. These leaders are believed by some to be among the messianic figures spoken of in the Dead Sea Scrolls and in rabbinic literature. And he's citing Encyclopedia Judaica, and that's 11, I guess it's volume 11, pages 1409 to 1411. I've never looked at that. Although noble attributes and spiritual, hold on, let me get to the next page here. Powers characterize such messianic servants, Jesus Christ exemplifies these qualities perfectly. And we see that in D&C 113, 1 through 2. Jesus is the exemplar prophet, priest, and king. He identified himself as the prophet like unto Moses, and that's in Deuteronomy 18:15, Acts 3:22 through 23, and 3 Nephi 20:23. And he was a high priest after the order of Melchizedek, according to Hebrews 5:9 through 10 and 7:15 through 22. Jesus is King of Kings, as it says in Revelation 19:16, greater than all other leaders of all time. Some see in Jesus Christ the complete fulfillment of the prophecy of a future David. Others feel that while the titles and functions of the future Davidic king apply to Jesus, there will also be another righteous king by the name of David in the last days, a leader from the loins of Jesse and thus of Judah. That's Victor L. Ludlow. And so Victor does a good job of just explaining the two different viewpoints here. Some feel like, nope, it was fulfilled in Jesus and it'll only be fulfilled in Jesus. And others are kind of like, well, there may be an extra layer here because it does seem like there's a servant figure that Christ sets up to be, it looks like both an ecclesiastical and governmental leader in the last days for the Jewish
Right.
people.
So
So,
so almost overseeing a theocratic governance of both
mhm,
religious and community affairs.
right. And so this is the big debate, right? It's like, is that a thing? It's very esoteric. And so there's a question about it, like, is it not? And some, like Gileadi scholars, are very opinionated. They feel like they've studied it enough that they're like, no, there's definitely something here. Something's gonna happen. They're not really able to predict or prophesy. He's not a prophet.
Mhm.
He's a scholar, and he has a testimony of the church. He's a part of the church. He's, like he believes in the prophets and the apostles. Okay. He's testified of them. I've heard him do this myself. Like, I've literally heard him say this multiple times. Like, he loves the prophets. Okay. And it's just that he doesn't always agree that the one commentary by like McConkie, for example, is the ultimate commentary. He's just trying to argue that there's several ways of looking at Isaiah based on this literary structure and the Hebrew way of thinking. McConkie focuses on one thing, and that's because it's coming from the Millennial Messiah series, like the Messiah series from the Millennial Messiah, where he's like, and I've already covered this. I want to show you guys really quickly. I've covered all of this commentary that I'm mentioning. I'm not going to pull it all up here because I'd basically be redoing work that I've already done. And so on my channel, I have a playlist. It's this one. It's called Latter Day David Servant Figure Study. And I've got 5 videos in there right now. I could add to this, but I haven't had time. And I'll probably have to like update the thumbnails. These are pretty old, but I did do a lot of work on this a long time ago, and I posted it. I put it into a playlist just so it will be easy for people to find if they want to. And I looked at all the McConkie commentary and just all these different commentaries. And the best analogy that I could come up with, which I know is really primary and probably falls short in so many ways, but it's very difficult to articulate. But the way that I tried to articulate it in this little series was, I was like, think of Joseph Smith as being the prophet of the restoration. In many ways, he is this latter day David. He meets the
Mhm.
criteria. Like, he's of Ephraim, but possibly also of Judah. He is the one, like, he's our link to the past dispensations. It's through the prophet Joseph Smith that we all become linked back generationally,
Right.
because he is the one who is directly linked to Jesus Christ. He's the servant that Jesus Christ calls. So Joseph fulfills like probably almost all of these prophecies, but not all of them, because he died and he's not here to do whatever's happening right now. Now, he may be doing stuff on the other side of the veil. We know that the gathering of Israel happens on both sides of the veil, but we're not
Right.
privy to that. And the scriptures are mostly, like you can see in Isaiah, it's talking about like things that are happening on earth, for mortality. And so, anyway, there's just this argument there that, hey, there's like this tail end of this restoration process that somebody does who's clearly a mortal, that can be hurt or marred, but
Right.
they're obviously not Joseph Smith. So then that helps you understand that there's a collective servant idea happening here. There's like a collective thing going on. And then that literary structure that Gileadi identifies, he says this shows that Isaiah's prophecy is primarily an end time scenario, meaning that it starts with like a domino effect of events that leads up to those key appearances of Jesus Christ that culminate in, his final appearance to the world in glory that opens the
Right.
world up for the millennial reign, where the wicked are destroyed and the earth becomes terrestrial. So this is a playlist that I made. You guys can look at that. It's on my channel, Latter Day David Servant Figure Study. It's just a little study that I did, and I was just trying to record it so that I could go back to it and revisit those things that I've studied, but then also so I could share it with other people who maybe didn't have time to do all of the work that I did for that. And there's more. Again, there's more that I could add. So it's just like a jumping off point for a study. And then the other thing that I wanted to show, so we've read Encyclopedia of Mormonism. We can see that there's kind of like two main
Mhm.
ideas of looking, like two main ways of looking at this very esoteric concept. And what I want to do is just show a little bit about Gileadi's way of looking at it and how there is actually support for this in your gospel library. Because there is a view that this is a thing, and that there could be some type of person in the end time who does lead people literally in some context that has to do with the second coming that hasn't happened yet. So it's like you can't, like, I've had people be like, well, how is that going to happen, and how this and how that, and it's like, well, we don't know the answer to that question. I mean, we just don't know, but it doesn't mean just because we can't picture how the second coming is going to go down exactly. Like, people debate even today, does there have to be a temple in Jackson County or not? Yes or no? Like, there's this is so esoteric. You're going to get a whole array of opinions on this, okay? And some people are like positive that they're 100% right. They know it all. And then others are, I'm more of like, well, I don't know. I mean, I know what I've studied. I can see it going this way. I can see it going that way. But
Right.
I'm content to wait and let it play out. And some people, they feel like they have to know all the answers before it even comes. And the problem with that I see is if you overcommit on an opinion and you're not willing to budge on the opinion, then that's not very meek or humble, and it's not teachable. So if what if
No.
you're wrong?
Right. Right.
And people interpret scriptures wrong all the time, and we all do. So it's just, I don't know. I try to keep more of an open mind, I guess. And so I want to show some of the things that the church has already said about this. Would that interest you, Tim?
Well, I mean, from what I'm hearing is that, so to kind of synthesize what you're saying is that there's this idea that the possibility of a person specifically named David is going to come into this role of the servant king, um as part of a fulfillment of the prophecy, not
Right.
the fulfillment, but a fulfillment of this prophecy.
Right.
Now, is that the question would be, is that pointing to somebody who may step into the role as prophet and leader of the church? Is that something
I
different?
mean, not
That's
necessarily. It doesn't have to be, and I think that's the thing is that they obviously, whoever receives their priesthood today,
Mhm.
their authority, they have to get it through the order that was set up, because we already
Right.
know that once the church is restored in the last days, it'll never be again be lost through apostasy. Like, this is one of the
Mhm.
promises, Daniel chapter 2, all the classical prophets prophesy this. So we have that promise. And so naturally, everything's going to be done through the presidency of the church, like
Right.
everything. Now, is it possible that there's correction that needs to come to us as people? Totally. That's what our prophets and apostles are doing every day. I mean, they're
Right.
trying to keep us on the straight and narrow, even like within our own scholarly world. Even, I mean, they put out all these gospel topics essays, for example, to kind of help keep us on the straight and narrow when people start veering off.
Right.
And so I just wanted to show that they've addressed this before. There's tons of stuff on this just within your gospel library app. Like, you don't even necessarily have to go look at Fair LDS or all these other places that have opinions. You can look in the gospel library and just see what's already been said about it. And
Yeah.
you can see that what Victor Ludlow put here is true, that there's kind of two main theories about it. One is that, there's not really going to be like an actual David the king sitting on a throne in Jerusalem. But there may be like part of the collective servant role, a
Right.
work. It's basically a
Well,
work. So I try to pull back and be like, okay, so it's defining parts of a total restoration.
right. Well, it almost sounds like that this is probably the reason why the Jews of the first century were looking for an actual Davidic king that would reclaim David's throne
Right.
and bring unification within Israel, and then campaign to bring Jerusalem and all of Judea out of the oppression of the Roman Empire to basically create Israel a sovereign nation and a sovereign people again, because they were under the Babylonian captivity, then they were under the Assyrian, they were under and then they came under the Roman. So they were always under an oppressive, another government that was oppressing them, and so that's what they were looking for. So, and I think that kind of parallels from what you're talking about, and I'll have to look into this a little bit more. because it does sound interesting. But I think from what you're saying, the guess is that it sounds like from the comments that you've kind of hinted at that there are some people that are kind of acting like the Jews of the first century, like this is the prophet that we're looking for. And they're missing
Mhm.
the point of what this actually is supposed to be
Right.
getting us to.
So there's 2 things actually. There's 2 extremes, kinda like you see probably everywhere, right? There's,
Right.
like, this, I don't know, like a political divide in the world, it seems, but there's one view, like you said, that's basically people looking for any excuse to condemn and accuse the brethren, the prophets, like
Right.
President Oaks and the Quorum of the Apostles. And then there's other people who are like, nope, nope, there could never be anything like this. Like, this is just heresy. And this whole idea that there could be some political figure functioning in the priesthood it's just not a thing. The gathering of Israel is already happening. There's never going to be like these physical things and all this stuff, and these are 2
Right.
extremes, okay? And so my view is more moderated. I try to keep it centered
Right.
and say, well, there's always a literal and a figurative fulfillment, or like spiritual fulfillment, like a physical and spiritual fulfillment. It's just that's just how it is. I mean, you can just look back at history and you can see that. And the ultimate fulfillment will be in the day of the Lord, like the day
Hmm.
of the Lord's judgment, when the judgment and the wrath of God is poured out on the earth, when the wicked are destroyed. That's like the ultimate fulfillment of these prophecies.
Hmm.
And so that's more what Gileadi's speaking to. He's just talking about one specific context. He's not talking about like all these other, like this whole collective time. He's talking about
Right.
like, hey, I've identified there through this literary structure that there is like an end time scenario that happens where kind of like it's a compression of events. So think of the labor
Hmm.
pains and the compression of events. Think about how it's like for Zion to be born, for the kingdom of God to be on the earth. There's all these prophecies that talk about a very difficult trial that God's people and the whole earth go through together, and the true and faithful come out of this as a righteous remnant preserved through a world of
Right.
wickedness and even some apostasy within its own ranks. This is kind of like the separating
Right.
of the wheat and the tares, right? And so and these people are still remain faithful and true this whole entire time. The keys of the kingdom are still preserved the entire time. And then this role that's described here, this is both on like a world collective level.
Right.
You can apply it individually too. Like you can look at it and say, well, how can I be a servant to the Lord? How can I be a witness of Jesus Christ and do like this servant does and emulate and model those attributes and characteristics that are being described? So you can look at it on the personal level, the collective community level, the national level, the world level. And that's how a lot of these types of prophecies that have this sort of structure, this kind of like apocalyptic type of
Right.
structure, can be viewed. You can do this with the book of Revelation too. And Richard Draper, he's like kind of like our in-house expert in the church on that. He's done tons of work on that on the book of Revelation, and it's very similar in terms of how it's written. It also has like these, like a 7-part structure to it. It implies like a pattern, like the number 7 apply implies the pattern. Okay, like when you see something divided that way, it's implying a pattern, that a pattern repeats. And so these are the kinds of things where if you start digging into some of the, I guess, like the Hebrew way of thinking that Nephi talked about in the Book of Mormon, then some of this stuff starts making sense. And you're like, oh, okay. And then you can see how multiple fulfillment of prophecy happens and how it keeps happening. And I have, again, there's a video that I have on that. There's like a little diagram that I have where it just shows a prophet at the bottom of a mountain range looking up through a telescope, and my friend Rodolfo made it, and it's really cool because it just shows like the little mountain range, the prophet's looking up, and it shows like
Hmm.
3 main peaks and little peaks in between. And the 3 main peaks are kind of like when a type is established, and then there's a fulfillment in the meridian of time of all these prophecies. And then there's a final peak, which is the second coming, when all of the prophecies are fulfilled, when all things are gathered in one in Christ. And in between that, there's little patterns, types and shadows that keep repeating in little patterns. And that's because it's really because of human nature. Like, as you start to understand the scriptures, you're like, "Oh, it's human nature." It's like the natural man in us that Nephi talked about is what is causing this repetition of, like, apostasy and repentance, and it's like we're constantly going through these little cycles. And so Isaiah poetically illustrates this pattern too. So one thing I wanted to show you in your gospel library is this little article here. How have the Jewish people come to view their early expectation of a Messiah? So this was a question that was sent into the Ensign magazine, and
Mhm.
Dr. Avraham Gileadi, he was a graduate student at the time, working over at BYU as a research assistant of ancient scripture. He responded to this, and here's his response to this question. And hopefully, this illustrates a little more. He says, "The mission of Jesus on the earth in the meridian of time was to accomplish the way whereby mankind might be redeemed from death and from the other effects of the fall. Even a Jewish rabbinical tradition now contained in the Talmud spoke of a man who would come and die on behalf of all mankind. This atonement was foreordained in a council held before the creation of the earth, according to the tradition. But in Jesus' time, the quality of religious observance of the chosen people was perhaps at its lowest ever. The keepers of the spiritual well neither drank themselves nor let others drink. Nationally, the Jews had enjoyed no lasting independence since before the Babylonian captivity over 400 years earlier. It was at this time that Jesus performed his mission of effecting the atonement. Indeed, the atonement of Jesus perhaps could only have been accomplished in such a dark hour of the Jewish nation's history. At his death, Jesus became numbered among the false messiahs of his day who sought the political redemption of Israel. Nevertheless, many Jews did believe him to be the Messiah in spite of his seeming failure. These included his personal disciples, whose missions were to testify of the death and resurrection of Jesus. Thousands of Jews, including many priests, were converted by their preaching. Since the time of Christ, Christians have traditionally stressed the spiritual mission of the Messiah, while the Jews have always clung to the political and human aspects of the messianic role. So, do you see those two extremes being illustrated there?
Right.
Christians, they want everything to be figurative, and the Jews want everything to be literal. Christians are all about the spiritual message, Jews are about the physical, savior. So it's just
Right.
that there's a problem there, right? He's identifying that
Well,
problem.
I think, and I've mentioned this before when we've had our "Come Follow Me" discussions, our live streams. Within the realm of modern Christianity, there is the idea that most Christians are led to believe that the church, the New Testament church, as they will refer to it, replaces the nation of Israel, that we are spiritual Israel,
Right, and
and
this
that there
is
really
that
is no gathering of
extreme.
Israel. But there's the remnant theology, because that's called replacement theology. And then there's remnant theology. Remnant theology is that God still honors his covenant with Israel,
Right.
and that he has set aside those individuals, a remnant that will be brought forth. Like, the reason we have the Book of Mormon, that is a remnant aspect of theology, that he saved a remnant of a portion of people to preserve his dealings with them, the prophecies, the Messianic prophecies, and the coming of Christ, and all of that. And so,
There's
yeah.
multiple times in our gospel doctrine that the rest of the Christian world doesn't have where you see God preserving a covenant people. But in
Mhm.
Joseph Smith's day, there was like a total destruction of God's covenant people on the earth, and
Right.
a full restoration was
Well, they
needed.
hadn't existed until late 18th, after the restoration. The idea of restoring Israel as a nation and as a people started getting underway in the late 1800s, and then
Mhm.
all through the early the dawning of the 20th century, and then culminated in Israel being declared a nation,
Mhm.
1948. So there was a period of time between late 1800s to 1948, that there was this process of restoring Israel.
So there's actually a whole ensign that's dedicated to this, and I want to show you guys that next. So let me just finish reading this because I think this little blurb that he has here, it's not very long. It answers this question of how have the Jews come to like view their early expectation of a Messiah? And he answers it here. So each side like Christians and Jews have tended to ignore the legitimate expectations of the other. And he's talking about mainstream Christianity.
Right.
And only since the restoration of the fullness of the gospel to the earth has a reconciliation of beliefs become feasible. The authority has been restored that will make possible Jewish messianic requirements within the framework of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter day Saints. And the reason I'm saying that with such an attitude right now is because I've seen people do this where they take Gileotti's like stuff. I honestly don't even think they've even read any of his books because when I see
Mhm.
them talking, it's like they're basically like, "Oh, the church is under condemnation and, they're in apostasy and some servant needs to come and correct the church." That is a complete misreading, not only of, I think, Isaiah, but also of Gileadi and his work, because that's not exactly what he's saying. He's saying that there's a framework that's been restored through the church, and the messianic requirements that the Jews believe in can be fulfilled through that framework of
Mhm.
the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And it's right there. It's in your ensign, February 1975, okay? And then this is a really good part. I have some commentary I can add on this, but he says Judaism, chiefly through Maimonides, has formulated three distinct missions that the Messiah will perform. Okay, so according to Judaism, their tradition, this is what they
Mhm.
think. In order of their occurrence, these are one, the establishment of the political kingdom of God on earth beginning in Israel.
Which was what they were looking forward to in the first century.
Yes, and we know that that prophecy will still come true, right? Like that is
Right.
part of our doctrine. And two, the building of a temple on the original site in Jerusalem. We still believe in this too, that that'll be
Right.
fulfilled someday. And three, the return of the lost 10 tribes. We believe this too. This is in our articles of faith, all three of these things. So we do believe this. And so he's just showing how we're in line with that Jewish way of thinking about this. Okay, so Latter day prophecies foretell the rising up of a prophet among the Jews in the last days to prepare the way for the second coming of Christ, whose mission corresponds to the Jewish messianic concept. Joseph Smith predicted a change would come over Israel in the last days of this prophet when he said, speaking of the Jews, quote, their unbelief has not rendered the promise of God to make with them a new covenant of none effect. No, for there was another day limited in David, which was the day of his power, when a prophet of the lineage of David shall be raised up. And then his people, Israel, should be a willing people. So he's talking about a point in time where the
Right.
Jewish people at large start accepting Jesus, like the
So, okay,
gospel.
so question here. Does this mean based on what this reads? Because the way it reads to me, the way I'm taking it away from this is that the Davidic servant, the Davidic king, is going to be a prophet that is risen up among the Jewish people, that is going to bring about the restoration of the 10 tribes. That it's going to be the hastening of the work, so to speak. So we
Mhm.
have our prophet, we have, who's leading Christ Church, but there is going to be like this
There's a
Jewish
special mission.
messianic prophet that's going to head the actual gathering of Israel, working in conjunction with the church, with the prophets and apostles within the framework of our church. But they
Right,
will
and we're
have their
all
mantle of prophetic, Jewish prophetic office.
well, and this person is raised up according to Giliotti, this is how he's interpreting it, okay?
Right.
And this is one theory. He believes that he'll actually come out of America, but he's raised up unto the Jews, like as an ensign to the Jews, like an
Mhm.
example of here is what you can do to be restored
Right.
to your Messiah. And so it's more of like, try to not think of it as a person who's just some prophet who gets raised up in the wilderness to correct the church. That's the wrong way to look at this.
Well, no,
That's
that's not
not
what
what
I'm saying.
he's
I'm just saying
teaching.
it just sounds like the way it's coming across that there's going to be an individual who is going to be, in a sense, stepping into this role of a Jewish prophet
Right. He steps into a role
and is
where,
working in conjunction with established keys of authority within
yes,
the church
yes, exactly. And
alongside
try
the
to think of it
prophets and
more that way.
apostles.
But the
So
reason
in
that I'm
essence, there
saying
will be
that,
two types of prophets
mhm.
in this.
Well,
There's
and the reason that I'm saying that that way, Tim, is not because of you. It's because these are the kinds of like things that I see where there's
right,
dissension in the church, like within our own church
right,
on this topic. And this is how you get people breaking off into some other restoration type branch, is because they're following
yeah,
someone who believes that they have been called of God to correct the leaders of the church. But this is not the right way to be looking at that. And I don't even see Giliotti saying that. And I think he gets
right.
a lot of flack sometimes that isn't really true. And it comes from people, as far as I can tell, who've never even read anything of his.
So it almost seems like, okay, so we understand that the office of a prophet, the prophet only holds the keys to the kingdom of God as pertaining to divine revelation, officiating in the salvific ordinances, and then that's passed down by the line of authority. And they receive revelation for the church. But it sounds like that there's a separate set of keys specific to the gathering of Israel that this person who will be a prophet from
No,
a
the
okay,
president of the church already holds those keys, and that was already established in Section 109 of the Doctrine and Covenants. So the president of the church holds the keys of the gathering of Israel according to Section 109 of the Doctrine
right,
and Covenants. But what I'm trying to say is, look at what the church is doing right now. We have 70s, we have like the main general authority 70, then
right.
we have all these other 70s under them, and that is how the structure of the church goes. And if you look at John the
Mhm,
Revelator's vision, you can see that even John seems to be prophesying of 70s upon 70s upon 70s,
right.
that is how this work goes forward. But that's how the keys get delegated to open up areas and
S
start things.
Okay,
So I
yeah,
have an answer to the question that you have, if
okay.
we can get through some of these sources.
All right,
Like,
all right, all right.
Tim, I have probably like 10 sources, and I think like by the time we're done looking at them, most of those questions that you have will be answered. So like, this is just one. So then he says, because the Jews rejected Christ, they were cast off from enjoying the rights of the priesthood and the gifts of the Spirit, enabling the Gentiles to receive the gospel and to be considered as people of the covenant. Paul, using the symbolism of the olive tree, indicated that the Jews would eventually be grafted back into the tree, while the Gentiles would be in danger of being broken off. Paul also said that receiving the Jews into the new covenant would be as, quote, life from the dead. That's Romans 11:15. But he said blindness in part is happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. Now, I'm just going to say this is a very loaded phrase. There's a whole study I've done
It
just
is.
on fullness of the Gentiles. It basically has to do with Ephraim's birthright in the end time. And that is what
This
Gileadi teaches too. Let me just finish this with
okay,
one little two sentences here. The Lord provided a means to dispel the partial spiritual blindness resting on the Jews when he commanded Latter-day Saints to seek diligently to turn the hearts of the Jews unto the prophets and the prophets unto the Jews. This is Doctrine and Covenants 98:16 through 17. As the mission of Ephraim unfolds, we may expect great things from Judah. So he's talking about tribes.
right.
And I have tons of commentary on this. Go ahead, ask your question, and I'll pull up
Well,
some
no,
of
it's
that.
not so much a question, it's more of a commentary because go back to the yellow highlighted portion that you just read.
Mhm.
Because I think what people don't understand is that when you go to Matthew 19, okay, and you start in verse 16, it's the conversation he has with the rich young ruler. But then after the rich young ruler walks away, the that narrative, that pericope does not end, because then he starts using it as a learning lesson and teaching, and Peter comes to him and says, well, we've left everything, what is there for us? And then he says, when the times of refreshing and restitution, you'll sit with me in judgment over the tribes of Israel. And then he goes in, but at the very last uh part of Matthew 19, he says, the first shall be last and the last shall be first. And then he gives the parable of the laborers in the vineyard, opening up Matthew 20. And then at the end of that parable, he then reiterates, the first shall be last and the last shall be first. And what that means to me is that the gospel was first preached to the Jews. And the gospel being preached to the Jews was about the fulfillment, the messianic fulfillment. And what is being said here is that uh they rejected Christ. They rejected who he was, and because of that, they crucified him. But now in the last days, so when are the first being the last? Well, it's the Gentiles. The Gentiles were the last people to hear the gospel before the close of the apostolic era and before the apostasy. And so Christ is hinting at a time when the first is going to be the last to hear the gospel, and the last people to hear the gospel are going to be the ones to first hear it. And that's the reason why even Christ himself prophesied of a coming restoration where the last people, the Gentiles who hear the gospel, are going to bring it to the Jews, and the Jews will receive it.
Right.
And that's
The last is
interesting
first,
for
the
that
first is last.
connection there.
But in the end time, the Gentiles receive it first and the
Right,
Jews receive it last, right?
right,
But once they receive it, once the Jews receive it, this is like a hastening, okay?
right,
And you see that playing out in the book of Revelation, in the book of Isaiah, I think in Daniel, I think in Ezekiel, in Jeremiah, in all of these classical prophecies, it's pretty much the same. There's kind of like a gathering phase. And then at the very end, there's like a hunting phase. And this is because the final appearance of Jesus Christ is about to come. And among whatever the backdrop is here, which is a huge war, it's like an overtaking by this king of Assyria character, which is a composite. Um, it's to represent what is happening. Then
right,
the world is being overtaken by a very heavy power, and the backdrop is a war. And so you see this happening, like the war to end all wars, right? We've all heard about this, and you see that in the book of Revelation, you see it in Isaiah as well, that there's some kind of a backdrop here where there really truly is a war that's overtaking the earth. And even in the middle of that, the Lord is gathering his people and he's preparing a kingdom,
right,
and a righteous remnant is being preserved. And so I think that, anyway, my point is, nobody needs to get like their panties in a bunch. Like, you don't need to freak out about stuff like this. You can just relax and understand that Daniel
right,
2, the stone cut out of the mountain without hands, is true. Like, we view that as the church, the kingdom of God will get established through this church, right? Like, that's how it's going to happen. And I think
right,
he's saying that here in this article too. He's like saying, hey, we finally have the ability to make this happen. Like, the authority's been restored that'll make possible the Jewish messianic requirements within
right,
the framework of the church. So he's putting a parameter on this. He's saying it's within the framework of the church. He's not saying it's completely outside of the church and the keys and all of that stuff.
right,
Even if somebody gets directly anointed and appointed by Jehovah, they still receive their authority through this structure and framework that's already been restored through the prophet Joseph Smith.
right,
So, like, even if God calls someone, which in the Messianic servant idea in Isaiah, you can see that it's Jehovah that's calling this servant, and the servant goes through a whole process. He goes through like descent phases and ascent phases until he achieves the ability to do this work that the Lord wants him to do, to basically be the last runner in a relay, if you want to think of it that way, where
right,
like the torch, the mantle of some of this work, the heavy parts, like the heavy lifting parts, is being passed on. And that's why I use the relay analogy, just because I don't know a better one, but there's a collective servant idea, and then there's like each little part of that, and then there's an
right,
end time role. And Gileadi is speaking, when he's talking about the end time servant, he's talking about like that final stretch of like what needs to happen just before the Savior comes. He's not talking about everything leading up to that. And
So
I think
would this
sometimes that gets
ideally be the
confusing.
last prophet that will herald in the
I don't know.
coming of
I don't know
Christ?
what it looks like, and
Okay,
he doesn't either, and he
okay,
doesn't feign to know. Like, he doesn't sit there and pretend like he knows. He's just like, "All I know is what I can see in the scriptures, and that there's some work that's being done here. There's some
Right.
servant role that is being completed and fulfilled. And what it's doing is it's leading to the ultimate fulfillment of
Right.
these prophecies, which we haven't arrived at yet, because that doesn't happen until Christ comes.
Things are still unfolding. Things are still
Things are still
unfolding.
unfolding, exactly, and so you can't it's easier to see those things, I think, in hindsight than foresight, unless you're a prophet and a seer,
Right.
because, that's just it's not really within our purview to be able to predict how these things happen, and that's why
Right.
Gileadi tries not to do that, and he gets frustrated, I think, because 'cause I've seen him get frustrated when people keep asking this question. It's like they want him to say what he thinks is gonna happen, and he's just like, "It doesn't even matter what I think, it just matters that you identify that there's this work that needs to be done, and that this needs to
Right.
happen through the keys of priesthood, and the Lord is working with his collective servant and potentially a servant
Makes
who's going to be
makes for
doing
an
part of
interesting
this."
study and discussion.
Right?
I do
So
have to dip out though because I got an appointment I got to run to. But yeah, this is fascinating. This is interesting. I have never actually given over into studying this. So thanks for this information. I appreciate it.
well, thanks for jumping on. Have fun at your appointment, and I'll just for the audience here just run through these sources that I have, and then you guys will know where you can go to find some of this stuff. All right, well, thanks, Tim. We'll see you
You're welcome.
later.
Have a good day.
You too. Okay, so going back over here, I have attached to this article just it was a lecture that Elder Ahmad Corbett gave at Fair LDS recently. And the reason that I gave it is just because he touched on this exact concept right here, highlighted in yellow. Because the Jews reject Christ, they're cast off from enjoying the rights of the priesthood and the gifts of the Spirit, enabling the Gentiles to receive the gospel to be considered as a people of the covenant. Well, in the end time, that scenario reverses. So again, this goes back to the last is first is last. In the end, the Gentiles, they receive the gospel first in the last days, but then they start falling into apostasy. They start rejecting the prophets, just like people did anciently, and just like the Jews did anciently. And they start rejecting their Messiah and rejecting the Lord's restored church, to be more accurate. And so that reversal of circumstances is going to start happening. And then this is where that original house of Israel, the kingdom of Judah, is going to have to start taking the reins. And this is the idea, is that there's like a flip-flop, right? It's like first this happened in the meridian of time and even anciently a certain way, and then it flips back in the end time. And so that's the idea there. And so he touched on this, and Ahmad Corbett, he explains this latter part of this paragraph where it says Paul, using the symbolism of the olive tree, indicated that the Jews would eventually be grafted back into the tree, while the Gentiles would be in danger of being broken off. So the Gentiles represent those people who receive the gospel first in the last days. And the original house of Israel represents the people who had it first in the time of Christ, in the meridian of time, the king of Judah, the tribe of Judah, the kingdom of Judah. And and then it says, Paul also said that receiving the Jews into the new covenant would be as life from the dead. So that is going to bring new life. Like think about how it would just reinvigorate even us as Latter-day Saints today. If you just saw like a mass Jewish conversion that wasn't just happening on the other side of the veil, but you could actually see this happening before your eyes, and it would reinvigorate and bring new life to the church. Well, you can kind of see that starting to happen as the church is branching out into the world, and we're grafting more and more people in back into the tree and the covenant with Jesus Christ. It does reinvigorate the church. We get new blood, new life into the church from all kinds of new people who are excited to live the gospel, where those who may be taking it for granted aren't excited. They're complaining and accusing prophets and apostles. And then you have all these new people joining the church who aren't. So there's like a feeling that's being described there. And we saw that happen in the early days too with Joseph Smith, when they went and had got a bunch of converts from England, and how that reinvigorated the church. So there's just this idea happening here of how bringing more people in can give new life. And this happens all the way through to the second coming. But he said blindness in part is happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. So that original house of Israel, they're blind. They're not seeing it until a certain point in time, but they will. They're prophesied to as at a certain point receive it. So Maud Corbett, he kind of touches on this. He gives this speech. It's called Prophets of the Past, Faithfulness in the Present. And I loved it. It was really good. He basically, I did like a little summary here, but he focuses on the importance of prophets and apostles and the ongoing work of the gathering of Israel and the adversary's efforts to prevent that work by causing us, God's covenant people, to oppose their leaders. Just like ancient Israel rejected their prophets in the past, we're going to see that happen today. And we already see it. We already see accusers of the brethren all the time. We already see people accusing prophets and apostles every day. We see people falling away and accusing the church and blaming the church for pretty much their whole life problems. And so it's like these things repeat, the cycle repeats. This is that pattern that 7-part structure helps us see. It's like when you identify that literary structure, then you can identify that there's a pattern, and then you can see the pattern. And the pattern is the same. It's basically the Nephite pride cycle. So that Book of Mormon pride cycle, that happens in Isaiah too. So Elder Corbett's speech was really good for just kind of illustrating that and how it is important that we have prophets and apostles and this ongoing work of gathering Israel. And he warned us that we're going to be seeing the adversary at play here, trying to get people to oppose their prophets. And he identified, I think, the house of Israel and the Gentiles really well, too. He talked about how the house of Israel, according to President Nelson, was described, and it's described as all who've made covenants with the Lord and who have accepted Jesus Christ as their Savior. That's how we kind of view it today in our modern context. That's not necessarily how the scriptures define it, though, and that's an important thing to note. It's good to keep the scriptures in context because depending on what book of scripture you're reading, there Gentiles is defined like 5 different ways, and so is the house of Israel. So, but like in our day, when you come into that covenant, then you start thinking of yourself as part of the house of Israel. And this group is global. It can be found in every nation, culture, and land. And that's because that gospel covenant's going forth, and we're trying to bring more people into this covenant with Christ. And if we remain true and faithful to that covenant, then we will be grafted into the tree permanently. We could lose that if we don't keep the terms of the covenants that we've made with Jesus Christ. Any one of us could lose that if we don't keep our covenants. And it ain't over till it's over. So we got to stay faithful. So Gentiles are included in the house of Israel. And President Nelson taught on this. He said that, just kind of clarifying that the house of Israel includes faithful Gentiles who've been grafted into the covenant family of Abraham. And so that kind of helps, us understand that once you receive the gospel, then you should start thinking of yourself as Israel and view the counsel that God gives to Israel for you. So the last day's mourning, the house of Israel, was another thing he touched on in his speech. And he said that this refers to Nephi's vision, where an angel warned that the house of Israel would gather together to fight against the 12 apostles of the Lamb. This opposition is associated with the great and spacious building, which represents the pride and wisdom of the world and had no foundation. The adversary deceives the Latter-day Saints, like the modern house of Israel, into fighting against their apostles through 3 main deceptive ways. And this is what he pointed out in his talk. He says pride is number 1. The universal sin, it leads to murmuring against prophets and apostles, often expressed by members saying things like this or that ought to be done differently than how the church or the brethren are doing it. So pride number 1, check yourself if you've said anything like that recently. Focusing on human weakness. The adversary tempts members to focus on the human flaws and imperfections of the Lord's servants, distracting from their sacred calling. Also, exploiting opposition. So, Lucifer exploits the opposition in all things principle by stirring God's children to focus inappropriately on the negative aspects of good things, echoing the role of the accuser of our brethren in the pre-mortal world. And remember who the great accuser is and his whole pattern. So to avoid this peril, this is Elder Corbett speaking, he shared a couple of principles from Moroni, and one of them is condemn not, do not condemn me, or do not condemn me not because of mine imperfections, neither my Father because of his imperfection, neither them who have written before him, applying this to the past prophets and apostles. And then he also taught us that we should learn to be more wise. So rather give thanks unto God that he hath made manifest unto you our imperfections, that ye may learn to be more wise than we have been. This forward facing faith and focus on greater things of the gospel enable members to avoid judging and condemning past leaders based on modern standards. And then I had pulled in like a complete transcript to this because I just thought it was such a good talk and it really illustrated what was happening here. So I just wanted to share that. And then the other thing I want to show you guys is in February 1988, Ensign, there is a article titled Nephi and the Exodus. And Gilead is just mentioned in this, but this kind of helped to illustrate this concept too. But it says Latter-day Saints believe that the Book of Mormon has some distinctively Hebrew characteristics, a belief that many non-Latter-day Saint scholars have either ridiculed or minimized. And this is true. We've had tons of scholars like minimize this and ridicule this in the past. I think more like some of the newer scholarship is like more open to the fact that the Book of Mormon does have Hebrew characteristics. And this seems to be kind of taking off at this point, that we can see a lot of this in the Book of Mormon. And it says, however, more and more scholars are discovering striking Hebrew parallels in the Book of Mormon, supporting that the scriptures claim that it has strong ties to the Jews and their learning. Recently, several researchers, George Tate, John W. Welch, and Avraham Gileadi, have noted that one of the most important of all Hebrew motifs, the Exodus cycle, is woven throughout First Nephi. Now, Gileadi talks a lot about this Exodus cycle, and the servant role is connected to like an end time Exodus. And we saw an Exodus that was done in the days of Joseph Smith and another one in Brigham Young's time. They both led in exoduses in early church history. And President Nelson did an article called The Exodus Repeated. I've done a video on that before, but you can just look it up in the Gospel Library. It's called The Exodus Repeated. And it'll explain how Joseph and Brigham fit types like Moses anciently, or Abraham or Joseph in Egypt, for example, like the connections there that we have to some of these ancient prophets with the work that modern prophets are doing. And he compares Joseph Smith to Joseph in Egypt and Brigham Young specifically to Moses. So this cycle, it's woven in First Nephi as well. Nephi himself was an Israelite born of Jewish parents and reared in Jerusalem. He tells us that he was taught in the learning of his father and that he employed the learning of the Jews in writing his record. That's First Nephi 1 through 2. And then, or 1 through 2. With his background, Nephi knew the vital parts of Hebrew history and literature. Nephi had access to the Exodus account on the plates of brass, which contained the 5 books of Moses and an account of Israel's deliverance from Egypt. However, even before Lehi's family had obtained the plates of brass, which undoubtedly aided in Nephi's study, Nephi still knew the story of the Exodus. Nephi's familiarity with the Exodus story is paralleled by his apparent familiarity with the Exodus cycle as a literary pattern. So do you see that literary pattern thing? This is recognized by the church too. Like we see that this is happening. The Exodus cycle is the pattern of enslavement and divine rescue used often in the Bible and in other Jewish writings. Since an Exodus cycle deals with how events fit the pattern of deliverance, the order of events is relatively unimportant. Hence, Nephi's account does not always follow the sequence Moses used in his writings, but it does share numerous motifs of the Exodus, some of which are listed in the accompanying chart. So he gives a chart down here in just a second. I'll show you that. But basically, there's all these like similarities that show like Exodus patterns in history. And there's like a final characteristic of the Exodus cycle, which he notes here, that marks the beginning of a new era. And this is going to be similar in the end time because the millennium is going to be the beginning of a new era, but there's going to be stuff that leads up to that millennium. And this is part of what Gileadi's identified in that structure, that there is an end time scenario that includes some type of an Exodus pattern where the remnants, like the righteous remnants who survived the Lord's day of judgment, that they do come out of Babylon. Like they come out of the rubble and the dust, literally, and they inherit the new era, which is the millennium. And this end time servant is supposed to be alive at that time and a part of that final like end time exodus into the millennium. Well, that obviously hasn't happened yet, so it's something that is to come. And I'm just going to skip down here, but this just shows all these different times where there's an exodus pattern noted. It helps you see that the Book of Mormon is just replete with this theme. And he's just looking at First Nephi. But there's lots of other exoduses. You can look, like when Alma's people, like Alma leads an exodus out of, under the reign of like King Noah's evil priests. And there's just so many exoduses there. Okay, so the other thing I wanted to show you is this other article in July 1975. And this is, this one is by Avraham Gileadi. And it was really good. It teaches a lot of how, let's see, just kind of how that Jewish religion practiced anciently, that there's like some, I think, correlations between like our view of the gospel and theirs. And so he kind of shows some connections here. And you can probably just go read this. It's actually really, really super short, but he's basically just going through and pointing out how Jesus rebuked the religious leaders of his day. They were in apostasy. He was trying to restore and set up the New Testament church. I think Barbara Morgan Gardner in her book Priesthood Power of Women does a really good job illustrating like the whole history of like how the priesthood functioned from like Adam all the way down to Joseph Smith. This was a specific time in 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 the meridian of time where a whole new structure gets set up. That's the New Testament church. And then that's what Joseph Smith restores, is that structure that Jesus Christ was setting up in his day. It didn't exist prior, though. Prior to Jesus Christ's time, there was a different structure at play in terms of how the gospel covenant was being carried to the people. And so that's a good thing to study in connection with this, but I just wanted to point this out as a resource. It'll kind of help explain our connections to Judaism as far as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints goes. And then, let's see, that's my notes. Okay, this is another note that I wanted to show you. This is some notes that I've taken from scriptures and different commentaries on scriptures from various scholars. And basically, there's this idea that there's this multiple fulfillment of prophecy, and this Davidic role is just a part of that. And in the scriptures, you can see that there's a David the prince and a David the king that are identified. And one of the scholars who I thought did a good job of making this as simple as I could possibly understand it was Dwayne Crowther in his book Prophecy Key to the Future. So he explains it this way. He's like, try to think of it as David the prince and David the king. David the king being Jesus Christ, the ultimate fulfillment, and then David the prince being a role that's both a collective servant role and then has an end time context for like the final stretch of the work that Joseph Smith began with the restoration. And so that's how he tries to explain it. And anyway, there's so much good stuff in this. And I've already covered it in that series. I'm not going to read through all of this, but we get into section 113 and we look at Isaiah 11, and we can see that there's 3 people being identified there. I've got the Bruce R. McConkie commentary, and he basically focuses on the end time ultimate fulfillment of Jesus Christ as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And that's fine, because he was talking about it in that context of like, yeah, this is Jesus. And nobody, even Avraham Gileadi, from what I've seen, has never denied that that's true. It's more just, looking at the patterns and like the work that's really being described. And there's clearly 2 figures being described there, Jesus being one of them, and then speaking with a servant. So anyway, that's kind of what all of this like ends up saying. And I just looked at all the different commentary that we had in the church on this idea of people interpreting who's the branch, who's the root, and all this stuff. The conclusion that I came to is that there's clearly Joseph Smith, Jesus Christ, and another servant figure being identified in Isaiah 11. So I copied some of my friend Rodolfo's notes too. He's really into this too. He dives really deep into Isaiah. He had a lot of good things to help me see like different passages of scripture where you can kind of see this. He had laid this out. He did a whole paper where he compared Hezekiah as a type, which Isaiah does in the book of Isaiah, so that you could kind of get an understanding of what does this even look like what would this person even look like. And there's so many types in the scripture that you can look at to kind of gain an understanding. And again, this would be a very end time context, like the final winding up scene basically is the context of all of this, and we're obviously not there yet. Now finally, I want to show you this article. It is called The Future of the Holy Land. This is in the May 1972 Ensign. And what's special about this Ensign is the entire issue was about the Holy Land and the prophecies pertaining to the Holy Land, including commentary on Judah must return, which is that quote by Joseph Smith. So, like, just going back a page here, this is an article in the Holy Land issue called Judah Must Return by Eldon Ricks. It's some scholarship that he has, and he notes that Joseph Smith not only prophesied the Jewish gathering, but also predicted that there would be a temple built here in Jerusalem before the coming of the Messiah. So there is supposed to be some kind of temple built there before Jesus Christ's final appearance in glory to the world, according to how it was being viewed, at least in May of 1972. And you'll see that theme in this whole issue if you read the whole issue. And I've actually listened to it like 4 or 5 times because it's so interesting. And in my series that I did, I read through many of these articles. So if that interests you, you can check that out. But basically, there is supposed to be some kind of a temple. That's one of the prophecies in Jerusalem, like literally in Jerusalem. And anyway, so that was something that the way that the prophets at the time and the scholarship of the day are interpreting this statement by Joseph Smith, that it does mean that there's supposed to be a physical temple there. And that probably coincides with, if you look at our gospel doctrine lessons, I think it's like lesson 36 on the second coming, in like the Institute manuals. It outlines those 4 key appearances of Jesus Christ. And so it probably coincides with that third key appearance. That's when Jesus Christ appears to the Jews. And then you see section 45 of Doctrine and Covenants coming to life with Zechariah, like 12 through 14. So anyway, those are some resources that you guys can look at that talk all about this end time servant. And here in the Future Holy Land article, you're actually going to get more than that. It'll give you a whole list, numbered bullet points of things that need to happen before the second coming. One of them is Elijah the prophet is to return to the earth. Check, because that happened. And then the descendants of Judah are to gather from the 4 corners of the earth. This is in process now. Like, this is happening. It's like one of those fulfilled and yet to be fulfilled, because there is an ultimate fulfillment of this. And it's what was just described in the previous article of Judah must return and what that looks like. And this is like a physical gathering, literally in the Holy Land of the Jewish people. Like, in here, what it says is, don't be surprised if someday a mission opens up in that land, even though it seems impossible today. That's basically the gist of it. We need to have faith that that'll happen. And anyway, there's so much good stuff. I can't even repeat all of this, but you guys should just go look at it. The descendants of Judah will use gold and silver from the nations of the earth to reclaim the land. This is one of those things that has been happening since the state of Israel came into existence in this modern era. And the land of Jerusalem's to be made productive. That's fulfilled and being fulfilled. The descendants of Judah will be attacked by their former conquerors, but they will be delivered. This is another one that's fulfilled and being fulfilled. This is still ongoing. Jerusalem will come under the control of Israel. And this is like fulfilled mostly, but still in development. It's being fulfilled. I mean, they do technically control it now. The Jewish people will begin to believe in Jesus Christ, and eventually the gospel will be preached to them. This hasn't really happened in full, not in its full sense. So, like right now, you have, like I interviewed a woman on my channel, Miranda. Hi, Miranda. She was one who grew up in Russia, but then during World War II era, her parents had to flee. They were Jewish, and they weren't like really practicing their religion at the time, but she came into contact with the gospel of Jesus Christ in America, and then eventually with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And she tells a whole story, but the point is she converted to the church, and now she's been able to do like over 800 ordinances for Jewish ancestry just because she is connected to them in her family tree. So there is work being done that is gathering Jewish people, but that's not the total ultimate fulfillment of the prophecies. And that's one of the things that you can start to see when you dig deep into Isaiah and like some of these literary structures that I'm talking about. It's like there's clearly an end time context where like the final big push happens. Like if you're thinking labor pains and delivery analogies. And then there's this new temple that'll be built. This obviously still hasn't happened. And there's a leader named David, a descendant of the ancient King David, is to become a great leader in Israel. So even here in 1972, you can see that the church had talked about this. They covered it in this special Holy Land issue. This is an idea that has been published. And then nations of the earth will gather together against the descendants of Judah, and Judah will be smitten. That hasn't happened yet. But that's that final thing, that battle that like Zechariah prophesied in chapter 14 and also is cross-referenced in Doctrine and Covenants 45, where Christ appears to the Jews in Jerusalem. And then there's these two prophets who are raised up to the Jewish nation. This was being viewed very literally. And in this Holy Land issue, you see kind of like a theme of this being like a literal view. Like this is like literally two prophets who are going to be doing work there. And that's kind of the takeaway that I got out of reading that issue. The Savior's to appear to descendants of Judah. So this is the Zechariah chapter 12 and Doctrine and Covenants 45, where he's like, hey, he does appear to people there and he shows them who he is. Now, you could say, oh, well, this is happening. Christ is appearing to all kinds of people. That's true. But remember, the context for this prophecy was the Mount of Olives splitting and the siege on Jerusalem. So there's like a whole context there that hasn't quite happened yet. But it's something that I believe will happen. And the Messiah will lead the people of Israel to victory, and later he will rule as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And note the later, because they're saying, again, there's a David the Prince and a David the King role that's described in the scriptures. And clearly our prophets and apostles understand this. It's all here in this Holy Land issue. They understand that there's these roles that are played. Now, they don't preach a lot about these esoteric doctrines. I mean, you don't hear even in general conference, prophets and apostles talking about plans to build a temple in Jackson County, Missouri. Like as far as we're concerned at this point, it's not something we worry about today because it is what it is. It's like when the time is right, it'll happen, surely. Like whatever the Lord prophesies, it'll come to pass. So this is just an important thing to know, I think, as far as if you watched that interview that Stick of Joseph did with Avraham Gileadi and you were like one of two of those opinions, either you're like, oh, there's a Davidic servant who's going to come and correct the church and correct the prophets and apostles. That's not really what's being taught there. And or if you're like the other kind of extreme where you're like, oh, everything he says, this is not even true. I'm not even going to accept this. Well, it's here. It's been talked about. It's been discussed. There's some kind of a role, some kind of a mission and missionary work that gets done that happens right before the second coming in the context of this great war to end all wars and this like post siege on Jerusalem. There's work that happens even past that before Christ comes in glory. But us as Latter-day Saints, I mean, we really need to be ready today, like now, like President Nelson said. And then it talks about two great world capitals are to be established, one in Zion and one in Jerusalem. And in the millennial time, Jesus Christ will rule and reign physically on the earth from these two places. But the way that this is reading in this context, it's kind of talking about that being set up in preparation for the second coming. So somehow something gets set up that kind of prepares the place, if you will, for the Lord to come. So anyway, that's the gist of it. I'm going to end this discussion here, and Tim's gone. And anyway, if you guys have any questions, you can put them in the comments. But go check out that playlist that I did. I think it's got all the goods in there, and it'll be at least a good jumping off point for a study. And if you have questions about this end time servant thing, there is actually a lot in there. I have like a whole bunch of stuff that I've collected on this, and I cover it in that Latter-day David series. Like we look at all of this, like these Joseph Smith papers. Um, there's a couple of quotes in there that mention this like David the king and David the prince type. And there's just the whole idea is something that it seems like in Joseph Smith's day they kind of knew and understood to some degree, but maybe even up to the 70s it seems like we understood it, and then really just like maybe in the last like 20 or 30 years we just don't. It's almost like we've forgotten it, or maybe we've become opposed to it, or we just for some reason it just nobody really seems to be understanding it or wanting to talk about it anymore. And we don't, I would say we don't even fully understand it. It just seems like it's a mission and a role, and there's some really good data here in the scriptures to suggest that yeah, there's something that somebody does that helps in a big way in the gathering of the 10 tribes, and like physically to safety in an end time context during this war to end all wars. So that's kind of the big takeaway for me, was that yeah, there's probably something that happens, some kind of work that needs to be done that will help us see it, like we'll know it when we see it, you know what I mean? So anyway, that's all for this one. Thanks for tuning in, for those of you who tuned in. And yeah, if you have any questions, drop them in the comments later, and yeah, I'll see if I can respond. Bye.